The house had always stood quietly on the corner of Willowbend Lane, painted in a warm, cheerful yellow that made it look like a permanent piece of summer. For years, it blended into the rhythm of the neighborhood, a place where children rode bicycles, retirees tended gardens, and people waved casually from driveways on their way to work. But everything changed the day a new homeowner moved in across the street. Her arrival was announced by the screech of an SUV's brakes, the thunder of car doors slammed with impatience, and the unmistakable sound of someone muttering complaints before they even reached their porch. That was the day Karen arrived. Karen was a woman who believed she had a personal responsibility to bring order to the world, even when the world had not asked for her help. She arrived armed with a clipboard, a magnifying gaze, and the conviction that she alone could determine what the neighborhood should look like. She inspected lawns with the sharpness of a seasoned detective, observed house decorations like a scrutinizing critic, and seemed to have a sixth sense for anything she considered out of place. Within days, she had inserted herself into the HOA board, something no one else had attempted so quickly, and from there, she began her crusade. The cheerful yellow house across from her seemed to offend her instantly. Its warmth contrasted sharply with her preference for dull tones, and though the house had stood painted that way for more than a decade, Karen behaved as if its color was a sudden attack on her personal well-being. Nearly every morning, she positioned herself at her window with the determination of a sentry guarding a castle. From that spot, she would glare across the street, fixating on the house as though it radiated some unbearable brightness meant solely to torment her. The homeowner, a quiet individual who enjoyed peaceful weekends and took pride in maintaining their property, soon found themselves at the center of unwanted attention. It began with little things. Notes left on the doorstep, folded with military precision, expressing concerns about the house's intensity. The homeowner dismissed the first few, assuming they were the work of someone who simply had too much time on their hands. But as the notes grew more insistent and more pointed, it became clear that this was not going to fade away. When the HOA received its first formal complaint about the house color, it was met with confusion. Many board members had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know the house had always been that shade. The complaint described the yellow paint as emotionally disruptive, a visual hazard, and an unapproved deviation from community harmony. It was the kind of language that hinted at a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate issue. But Karen pushed relentlessly, insisting that the paint violated rules that had never been enforced before, or perhaps never even existed. A surprise inspection soon followed. Residents watched from their porches as Karen marched alongside the HOA's compliance officer, pointing at the house with the fervor of someone revealing the location of buried treasure. The officer, caught between HOA politics and the reality of the neighborhood, gave an awkward series of nods while glancing at the community's covenants. Nothing in the documented guidelines restricted house colors beyond a general suggestion for neighborhood consistency, and consistency was clearly a subjective matter in this case. Still, Karen demanded action. She insisted the paint be removed and replaced with something respectfully neutral. She referenced imaginary rules and interpreted vague statements as ironclad law. The homeowner, tired of the persistent harassment, requested a formal meeting. The HOA scheduled a hearing, hoping it would resolve the matter quietly. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had lived there for years were baffled. Some joked that they had never seen someone so passionately offended by a paint color. Others were worried, recognizing that if Karen succeeded, it could trigger a chain reaction of unnecessary policing. The hearing became the talk of every driveway, backyard barbecue, and evening dog walk. But despite the murmurs, most people agreed on one thing. The yellow house brought joy, and a neighborhood shouldn't be robbed of joy. On the day of the hearing, the room filled quickly. The homeowner arrived carrying a folder of records showing the paint color had been approved years earlier. Karen arrived with her clipboard, stacks of printed papers, and a determination that bordered on theatrical. As the meeting began, she launched into a speech describing the yellow house as a disruptive spectacle, a source of emotional strain, and an unnecessary visual assault. Each statement was more exaggerated than the last. The HOA board listened politely, but their expressions revealed discomfort. They had not expected this level of intensity. When it was the homeowner's turn to speak, they described the history of the house, the approval documents, and how there had never been a single complaint until Karen moved in. They talked about the importance of individuality in a community and the absurdity of treating a cheerful color as if it were a crime. The board members reviewed both sides, whispered among themselves, and finally concluded that there was no violation. The color had been approved, it caused no harm, and there was no reason to demand a repainting. Karen was furious. She left the room in a storm of indignation, claiming the board was biased, the rules were outdated, and the neighborhood was descending into visual chaos. She vowed she would not let the matter rest. In the days that followed, she escalated her efforts. She wandered door to door, attempting to gather signatures for a petition. Most residents politely declined. A few gently closed their doors to avoid confrontation. Some openly laughed, unable to understand how a peaceful street had turned into a battlefield over a shade of yellow. When her petition failed, she took to social media. Posts appeared in local groups complaining about the blinding brightness of the house, describing it as a public nuisance. The posts gained little traction. Some residents began defending the yellow house publicly, which only fueled Karen's irritation. It seemed the more she fought the color, the more attention it attracted, and the more the neighborhood rallied around it. Then, fed up with Karen's attacks, the homeowner decided to do something unexpected. Instead of continuing the back and forth, they proposed a different solution, one that would remove personal bias and settle the dispute once and for all. They announced they would let the entire neighborhood vote on the new paint color for their house. Whatever color received the most votes would become the new shade. The announcement sent a ripple through the community. Some were thrilled by the idea. Others were amused. But Karen saw it as an opportunity. Finally, she believed she could force the house to conform to her taste. She immediately began campaigning for washed-out gray, the color she deemed appropriately respectful. Little did she know, the neighborhood had an entirely different. The announcement of the neighborhood vote spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, it seemed every resident of Willowbend Lane had heard about the unusual proposal. Some found it entertaining, others found it refreshing, and a few saw it as an opportunity to unite the community in a way the HOA rarely did. It became clear almost immediately that this was no longer just a dispute between one homeowner and a problematic neighbor. This was becoming a neighborhood-wide event. People emerged from their houses, gathering on sidewalks and front lawns to discuss potential colors. Children who rarely paid attention to anything HOA-related suddenly had strong opinions about bright blues and neon greens. Retirees who once spent their days quietly trimming hedges now debated the merits of warm oranges versus sunflower yellows. Even those who normally avoided involvement found themselves drawn into the growing excitement. The conversation had become something bigger than the original conflict. It was a collective reclaiming of neighborhood spirit. Meanwhile, Karen viewed the situation with a grim seriousness that contrasted sharply with everyone else's enthusiasm. She paced across her porch, gripping her clipboard as though it were a shield, convinced that this vote would finally give her the victory she felt she deserved. She doubled down on her campaign for a subdued gray, approaching residents with persuasive lines about restoring visual order and protecting property values. Her tone, however, only pushed people further away. Many politely nodded but privately rolled their eyes. Others avoided her altogether. She seemed completely unaware of how isolated her crusade had become. The homeowner, on the other hand, maintained a quiet composure throughout the growing excitement. Their goal was not to win or lose, but to teach a lesson in unity and acceptance. They created a fair voting system. A simple ballot, one vote per household, submitted anonymously. A list of color options was made available, including Karen's preferred gray, the original yellow, and several vibrant alternatives. To ensure transparency, the ballot box was placed at the community park under a small tent where volunteers took turns monitoring it. The voting would last 3 days. Those 3 days transformed the neighborhood. On the first day, families strolled to the park with casual excitement, casting their votes between picnics and conversations. Dogs tugged at leashes, children chased each other across the grass, and the ballot box slowly filled. The mood was cheerful, almost festive. People treated the occasion like a small community celebration, grateful for a rare moment of unity. On the second day, the energy grew even larger. More residents showed up, many bringing homemade snacks to share with others. Laughter echoed across the park, blending with the sound of shuffling ballots and folding chairs scraping against the ground. Even residents who rarely left their homes appeared, curious to be part of something so unexpectedly positive. They lingered beneath the shade of the tent, commenting on how refreshing it felt to see the community come alive. For Karen, however, the experience was far from pleasant. She made several determined appearances at the park, watching the voting with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. Her eyes scanned every hand that dropped a ballot into the box, trying to guess which color each person had chosen. Her presence cast a brief shadow over the cheerful atmosphere, but people quickly resumed their laughter the moment she walked away. She could not understand why the neighborhood seemed to be embracing the very thing she opposed. By the third day, it became clear that something dramatic was unfolding. While Karen assumed the community would rally behind her vision of neutral colors, the conversations happening around the park told a different story. People spoke excitedly about the possibility of choosing a bold, lively color, a shade that would symbolize the neighborhood's resilience against unnecessary control. The question that once centered around one house had now expanded into a reflection of the community's identity. When the final afternoon of voting arrived, the park was bustling. The ballot box had grown heavy with sealed slips, its sides bulging slightly from the volume inside. Volunteers carefully guarded the remaining hours of the vote, ensuring the process remained fair. And through it all, the homeowner watched quietly from a distance, observing how what began as an annoying conflict had transformed into something unexpectedly meaningful. At sunset, the voting officially closed. The box was sealed, and 3 volunteers, the most trusted, long-term residents of the neighborhood, were chosen to supervise the counting early the next morning. The anticipation was electric. People went home with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, wondering which color would win and what drama would follow. The next morning dawned clear and warm. As the sun rose over the rooftops, a small group of residents gathered beneath the tent to begin counting the ballots. Word spread quickly, and soon a significant portion of the neighborhood had gathered nearby. People whispered guesses to each other, some confident the original yellow would win, others convinced a new color would take the title. Karen, determined to witness her impending victory, stood at the front of the crowd with her arms crossed, ready to celebrate what she believed would be a return to proper order. The counting began slowly and carefully. One by one, ballots were opened and tallied. The volunteers called out the chosen colors quietly, with another volunteer recording the totals on a large sheet of paper. At first, Karen seemed hopeful. She heard a few grays called out and allowed herself a small, triumphant nod. But as the count progressed, a different pattern emerged. The occasional neutral color appeared, but far more frequent were the bold shades: bright blues, vivid oranges, playful pinks, and fluorescent greens. Then came the color that began surfacing again and again. A shade so loud, so brilliantly luminous, that it drew chuckles each time it was mentioned. It was described on the ballot list simply as Sunburst Citrus, a color brighter and bolder than the original yellow, almost glowing like a neon sunset. The moment the first vote for it was announced, the crowd erupted in laughter. When the 5th vote appeared, laughter turned into curiosity. By the 10th vote, people exchanged excited glances. And by the 20th vote, it became clear the neighborhood had chosen not just a color, but a statement. Karen's face transformed from confident to horrified. Her shoulders stiffened, her expression froze, and her clipboard dipped slightly in her tense grip. She listened in disbelief as vote after vote was counted, pushing Sunburst Citrus further into the lead. It quickly became the unstoppable frontrunner. When the final ballot was counted and the total announced, the neighborhood cheered. Sunburst Citrus had won by an overwhelming margin. The community had spoken, loudly, literally, and humorously. The homeowner accepted the results with quiet satisfaction, knowing the neighborhood had embraced unity in a way no one expected. Meanwhile, Karen stood frozen, processing the fact that not only had she lost, but she had inadvertently inspired the community to choose a color even brighter than the one she despised. The stage was now set for the next chapter, the repainting of the house, and the chaos that would follow once the new color lit up. The morning after the vote felt strangely quiet, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The homeowner spent the early hours preparing for the transformation, gathering supplies and arranging for the painting crew that had already been contacted days earlier. While the vote had determined the final color, the homeowner had wisely prepared for the likelihood of change long before the ballots were cast. When the painters arrived with buckets labeled Sunburst Citrus, even they paused, lifting the lids with amused disbelief at the color glowing inside. Word spread quickly that work had begun. Residents slowly wandered outside, eager to witness the first brushstrokes of what would become the most talked-about house in Willowbend Lane. The painters set up ladders, placed drop cloths carefully over the bushes, and began to prime the walls. The original yellow tone, once the center of so much controversy, faded beneath a fresh layer of white primer. As the old color disappeared, a sense of symbolic closure washed over many of the onlookers. One era was ending, and another, far brighter, was about to begin. From her porch, Karen watched with a mixture of dread and disbelief. She sat rigidly upright, her posture stiff, her clipboard resting on her lap like a forgotten relic. She had hoped, even expected, that someone would realize how preposterous the winning color was and intervene. But no such intervention came. The HOA remained silent, having recognized that the vote was legitimate and binding. Neighbors were buzzing with excitement rather than outrage, and the homeowner, calm and resolute, seemed completely unbothered by the intensity of the color they were about to embrace. As the first can of Sunburst Citrus was opened, a ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. The paint shimmered unnaturally, almost glowing from inside the bucket like molten gold mixed with neon fire. It was a shade that refused to be ignored, a color that demanded attention, and one that would forever change the aesthetic of the street. The painters dipped their brushes and rollers into the glowing liquid, and with steady strokes, they began coating the house. Immediately, the brightness was undeniable. Each stroke illuminated the wall with a vivid, electrifying radiance. Sunburst Citrus did not merely brighten the house. It transformed it into the focal point of the entire block. As the painters continued, a soft hush fell over the spectators. Some gasped, others grinned. A few whispered to each other, marveling at just how bold the color turned out to be. Children pointed excitedly, comparing the house to everything from cartoon suns to lemon candies. Karen, however, experienced the transformation as a slow-motion nightmare. With every stroke of paint, her expression tightened further, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as if bracing against an imminent storm. The brightness seemed to reflect off the windows directly at her porch, forcing her to squint repeatedly. She shifted uncomfortably, leaning away from the spectacle as if trying to distance herself from the very concept of joy. Yet despite her obvious discomfort, she could not tear her gaze away. Throughout the day, more residents joined the growing crowd. Cars slowed as they passed. People from nearby streets strolled over after hearing rumors of the outrageous color choice. What had begun as a simple repainting had evolved into a community event, something no one wanted to miss. Homemade lemonade appeared on folding tables. Lawn chairs sprouted across several yards. At one point, someone even joked about bringing sunglasses for Karen, a remark that drew a chorus of quiet laughter. By late afternoon, the house was fully coated in Sunburst Citrus. The color blazed across its walls like a radiant beacon, standing out against the greenery and neutral-colored surroundings. It was unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before, an unapologetic burst of brightness that reflected the collective spirit of the community more than any muted shade ever could. As the painters cleaned their brushes and packed their supplies, neighbors applauded their work. The homeowner stepped outside, taking in the final result with a mix of amusement and pride. Karen, however, reached her breaking point. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping sharply against the porch boards. For a few moments, she paced back and forth with restless agitation, her clipboard swinging in her hand. She attempted to compose herself, adjusting her posture and smoothing the edges of her shirt as though preparing for battle. But when she finally stepped down from her porch and walked toward the freshly painted house, her movement carried a sense of resignation rather than authority. The homeowner noticed her approach and simply nodded in acknowledgement, offering no hostility or triumph. The neighborhood fell quiet, their attention shifting entirely to the tense procession unfolding before them. Karen paused several feet away from the house, staring up at the glowing facade. Her expression softened, not with acceptance, but with the realization that she had lost something she had chased far too aggressively. Control, she turned slowly, looking at the crowd gathered behind her. Dozens of faces watched her with calm, expectant expressions. There was no mockery in their eyes, no gloating, only a silent understanding. The vote had been fair. The community had spoken. And though she did not like the result, she could not deny the legitimacy of the process. Without a word, she pivoted and walked back to her house, her steps slower than before. The crowd gradually dispersed, leaving the street filled with light chatter and lingering amusement. The homeowner returned inside, feeling a quiet sense of closure as the final rays of sunlight reflected brilliantly off the new paint. And the following weeks, the house became a local landmark. Visitors passing through the neighborhood often slowed their cars to admire the vivid hue. Children used the house as a meeting point, calling it the glowing house. Some residents even painted small decorations or flower pots in matching shades, turning the bright color into a theme that subtly spread across the community. The change brought a sense of unity, reinforcing the idea that a neighborhood was defined not by strict uniformity, but by the shared experiences that brought people together. As for Karen, she eventually retreated from her attempts to control every detail of the street. She attended fewer HOA meetings, abandoned her clipboard, and stopped monitoring the neighborhood from her window. Over time, she adjusted, perhaps reluctantly but inevitably, to the vibrancy that now lived across the street. And while she never openly expressed approval, she no longer fought it. In an odd way, the brightness seemed to soften her, reducing her need for conflict and shifting her focus to the things that truly mattered. In the end, the house that once sparked irritation became a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. It reminded everyone that community was built on shared decisions, mutual respect, and the willingness to embrace differences, even when those differences came in the form of a dramatically bright shade of citrus paint. And as the seasons changed and sunlight danced across the radiant walls, the neighborhood of Willowbend Lane flourished in a newfound harmony, one brought about not by strict rules, but by the choice to stand together, even when the path was unexpected.